What's up, everybody? How's it going? I am Ian Douglas. I'm the author of the techinterview.guide website. Let me shut down that one. There we go. All right, cool. Welcome to the stream. Got a couple of viewers online. Tonight's just going to be general Q&A. Ask me anything. Probably not going to go real long tonight. It is my oldest son's birthday. I now have a teenager in the house. Hooray! So happy birthday to William. And yeah, so I'm going to do Q&A. As always, feel free to drop in chat if you got questions and stuff. Otherwise, I'm just going to be kind of sharing questions that I found. These Q&A sessions seem to be pretty popular. The more questions I answer to kind of drain out of my queue, the more show up. So definitely keep sending me those questions over Twitter, over LinkedIn. If you want to DM me on Twitch, you can send me messages there. So all the different places you want to send me a message. All my contact information is on the website at techinterview.guide. And you can definitely send me questions, and I will always ask them anonymously. I will never give your name on the stream. Unless you specifically ask me to, then I will. But generally I won't. So yeah, tonight's just going to be general Q&A. This coming Thursday, I don't think I've got anybody lined up for this week. I might have someone on the show next Sunday that I've been meaning to have on since July. His name is Chris, so I think I'm going to try and get Chris on the stream next Thursday, though, on the 14th. 14th is actually going to be a really busy day for me. I'm running a resume and LinkedIn workshop for a local code school. But the night of the 14th, I'm going to have Dan Moore on the show. He wrote this really great book called Letters to a New Developer, and he's going to be on the stream on October 14th. So you definitely want to come check that out and ask Dan lots and lots of questions. So Dan is a really, really great mentor, and he loves helping new people get into the tech industry. So definitely come by, and he's also a big part of local Ruby meetups and so on. Really outstanding guy, really great advice, really good to talk to. He's in a lot of Slack communities and so on. So definitely hit up Dan anytime you have questions as well. Cool. Let's get into the questions. So as I mentioned, if you've got questions kind of as we go, feel free to drop them in chat. I'm more than happy to address those as part of the live stream anytime. Otherwise, I'm just going to go through a bunch of questions, and then per usual, I'm going to come back later on and like clip this video into smaller videos and kind of queue those up just for the YouTube algorithm of getting more things out there. And I'm going to drop this in chat again. If I do a bang podcast, we now have a podcast. And so basically what I set up is all of the audio from the shorter clips of these kinds of questions. I am now putting out in a podcast format. So there's a link in the chat that you can go check out. It's techinterview.guide/podcast. And basically the podcast, like I said, is just the audio of these question and answer sessions with a little bit of an intro, a little bit of an outro kind of thing, just to kind of get people on the website and subscribe to the daily email series and all kind of stuff. But you can check that out. It's now up on Apple, Google, and Spotify as podcasts, and I'm using Podbean to manage all of that. So appreciate everybody that I reached out to over the past week to get recommendations on who to host podcast episodes with. I ended up going with Podbean. Relatively decent cost for what they provide as far as like storage and bandwidth and all that kind of stuff, and the amount of podcasts that I can upload. So there's a number of episodes up there already. They will not necessarily release in the same order of what I put out on YouTube. And so you may hear podcast episodes before they come out on YouTube. You may hear these Q&A things on YouTube before they come out on the podcast. So it's a surprise. You'll have to go listen all the time. Generally, though, the questions I try to keep like 2 to 3 minutes, sometimes as long as 5 minutes or so, just so the podcast things are really short. So you can probably just blast through all the podcast stuff. Occasionally, just listen to several episodes at a time. If you do have feedback on the podcast, I'm always more than happy to take input and feedback on those. So if you have any feedback on the podcast as far as like audio quality or kind of the production and all that kind of stuff, please hit me up and let me know. Otherwise, let's get into the general Q&A for tonight. First question on the list. If software engineers can spend months and months preparing for technical interviews, why can't companies spend 5 minutes simply stating the clear reasons why the candidate was rejected so they can improve their preparation for future interviews? This is a fantastic question. I wish more companies were willing to give feedback. It's really disappointing as a candidate that You apply for a job and you go through some amount of the process and then never hear back why you didn't progress forward. It's one thing, and I've addressed this on the stream a bunch of times, it's one thing to apply and never get a call. It's another thing to apply and start to get in the phone calls and start to work through the progress of what that company's technical interview process is, and then not get a phone call back or say why you're not moving forward. It's super disappointing. And unfortunately, there's no good reason why companies can't give feedback. A lot of companies are very afraid that they're going to get sued. We've talked about that on the stream in the past. Aileen Lerner from Interviewing.io has done some research with her team, and they said nobody in recent history has been sued because they gave feedback. It might have happened like a decade ago, and that kind of got everybody scared. But it's not something generally that happens. And so companies shouldn't be afraid of giving feedback. And I think that the person that asked this question is dead on. If we're spending months and months preparing to do these interviews, why can't a company spend 5 minutes to say, hey, thanks for applying, thanks for going through the process, this is why things didn't work out, better luck next time? Because it is a business decision. It's not a personal reason why they rejected you. They're trying to make a business decision over whether they think you're going to be a good hire for that role at that time. And their decision is like, nope, you didn't make it for whatever reason, but they should give you that reason. It's silly that people don't give those reasons. And it's super disappointing as a candidate. So I'm a firm believer that companies absolutely should take some time. If you have at least started a candidate through the process, you owe it to them to give them some amount of feedback to say, yes, this is why you didn't progress, or here's what you could do better, or this is just some general feedback. Maybe it's not something that they could have particularly done better. It's just someone was better than you. That's not necessarily helpful feedback either as a candidate, but by knowing, someone had a little more experience in this particular area, now it's like, okay, well, if I want to reapply for that job in 6 months, I know that over the next 6 months, I need to up my game in that particular area as well, if you still want to work at that company. The other kind of interesting thing is a lot of companies are like, well, we're not going to progress through the process now, but if you want to reapply in 3 months or 6 months, well, if you're actively applying for a lot of jobs, you're probably going to start another job. I'm very unlikely to reapply for that job in 6 more months unless it's been 6 months and I still haven't found a job. But I mean, hopefully, through resources that we all share on the internet and the work that I do on this podcast and other people do on their streams and podcasts and so on, hopefully it's not taking you 6 months to get that job. Like, we're all here to help you. So lean on us, ask us questions. We want to help you get that job. But for a company to come back and say, well, just reapply in 6 months, well, I'm probably going to be employed somewhere else. I'm probably not going to be reapplying in 6 months. Like, I might reapply in a year or two or a year and a half or something like that. But probably not in a short amount of time. So, all right. Next question on the list here. How do I prepare for a technical interview in the whole live coding portion for a software engineer role? This one comes up pretty commonly, and there are a lot of different things that you can do to prepare. The technical interview aspect, by that point, you've already kind of gone through like initial phone screens, and they've kind of looked at your resume and they've looked over your whole profile and go, yes, so far you kind of fit the pattern of what we're looking for in a candidate. So we're going to continue to work with you and keep you going through that process. When you get to the technical interview portion of it, there's kind of two parts. One is answering technical questions about your background, like what's your experience working in this particular programming language, or what's your experience working in this or that kind of framework or toolkit or something along those lines. And then there's going to be the actual technical coding challenge that typically comes in a lot of modern software development interviews, at least here in North America. There are a lot of different aspects to what that part of the interview is going to be like, and so knowing how to prepare is actually really tricky. I would say the number one thing to do is ask the company what their process is and say, hey, when I come to that technical interview, or if you're doing it remotely, what can I expect to do? What should I, expect to study and expect to be asked about? Now, they're not going to give you specifics and say, we're going to ask you this question and this question and this question. they're going to be a lot more vague about it and say, you should study these kinds of concepts, or, study up on data structures. But hopefully they're being a little more careful about telling you at a more practical level which data structures to study or which kinds of algorithms to study. Because to just say, go study data structures and algorithms is too broad. It's too vague. There's so much that you can go study. It's not enough just to say, study data structures and algorithms. I think companies, again, kind of owe it to candidates to some degree to say, these are the kinds of questions that we're going to ask about. These are the kinds of things that we want to talk to you about. And again, you'll hear me say this a lot on the stream. Interviews should be more conversation than interrogation. And so I'm really hoping that over time, companies are going to start to realize that these things just need to be two-way conversations between you and your interviewer, and less where they're just throwing you a question, you give them an answer, and they throw you a question and they give you an answer, and you throw a question, they give you an answer. Like, it needs to be more conversation. Like, I ask you a question, you answer it, and maybe that, takes off in a whole different direction. That's what interviews should be, in my opinion. That's really what interviews should be. So when it comes to what to prepare, data structures and algorithms at a very broad sense are good things to know, but there are sort of common study guides that you can see. Last Thursday we had Sean Prashad on the stream, and he and I had a really good conversation. You should go check that out. It's up on YouTube. And we had a really good conversation about the tool that he built, which is just kind of this leak code what's the word I'm looking for? Collated kind of interview problems that he's found on LeetCode, partly from LeetCode Premium and partly from other sites as well, where he's kind of like taking the best of the best, and he's getting all of that content up on a site that he's building and managing. And you can use tools like that to go find, well, what's the likelihood that I'm going to be asked these kinds of algorithm questions at these kinds of companies? The top 4 that I've seen in my experience so far are depth first search, breadth first search, backtracking algorithms, so all your traversal kinds of algorithms, and then like dynamic programming, which can incorporate some of those backtracking and sort of traversal algorithms. You may get asked a little bit about search type algorithms, like go find a thing in a tree, but really anything where you're trying to go find other information is really coming down to some sort of traversal algorithm anyway. But there are also like 2-pointer problems and heap problems and fast and slow pointer problems and array problems. There's a lot of different sort of categories of them. I would say definitely practice up on those top 4, but there are also other kinds of categories and other types of algorithms that you could also study as well, just to be ready because you really don't know. But hopefully if you ask the company will be really upfront with you and say, these are the kinds of questions we're going to ask. These are the kinds of things that we would like you to study so that you're bringing your best self to that interview. And again, they're not going to tell you exactly what to go study, but they will give you some amount of direction if you ask. So ask. Worst thing they'll say is like, something really vague. But at best, like a lot of the FANG companies, they have like full publications on these are the things we want you to study to be ready for our interview process. And so they actually do quite well at sharing that kind of information. So just ask the company. They should give you some amount of information there. The next one, which is kind of on a similar topic, someone's asking, how can I interview my programming logic to succeed in technical interviews? And this question kind of stems from the idea of, well, now I have a technical challenge. How do I get better at solving those kinds of technical challenges? The good news is it comes down to practice. The bad news is practice takes time. And if you haven't got the time, you kind of need to know, well, what do you study? How do you study best? I built up a YouTube video a little while back using Sean's website, and you can go find that on YouTube. Just search my YouTube. It's youtube.com/Ian Douglas, and on there you can search for a video about LeetCode and how to shorten that LeetCode grind. And what I do in there is I kind of talk about, like, go find those top algorithms and then go find how other people solve them and kind of reverse engineer their solution into pseudocode, so that you can study the strategies. So the next time someone says they give you a problem, you're like, oh, that sounds like the knapsack problem, or that sounds like the making change problem, or that sounds like, this or that kind of problem, like, number of islands kind of problem. you'll have a better idea of, oh, that sounds like it's going to be this kind of algorithm. So let me go apply that strategy in some pseudocode and let me see if that's going to solve the problem. And if it does, great. If it doesn't, go figure out what other kind of problem it might be. So there's lots of tools out there to do that kind of stuff, but you can definitely check out that YouTube video. I'll go try to find it real quick and I'll drop that in chat as well. So let's see. YouTube, Ian Douglas, LeetCode grind. There it is, copy address, and we will go paste that in the chat. All right, so this is my LeetCode grind video, and I'll put that in the YouTube show notes as well. And if you're listening on the podcast, again, you can just go to youtube.com/Ian Douglas, and you'll see a little search on there, and you can just search for LeetCode, and you'll see a video called How to Reduce the LeetCode Grind to Prepare for Technical Interviews. Again, that's just one way to sort of prepare. But by coming up with those strategies, I find that studying those strategies, like for a backtracking algorithm, for example, you're looping over a number of decisions. You're applying a decision, and then you're probably doing some kind of recursion to repeat all that work. And then when the recursion returns, you're maybe going to undo that decision that you made, and then going back up to your loop to the next decision, and so on. And so every backtracking algorithm comes down to those 4 steps. You're looping over something, you're acting on that decision, you're recursing, and then you're undoing that decision. And then you go back up to the loop until you run out of things to do, and then that returns from how it got called. That's every backtracking algorithm in 4 steps. And so as you can reverse engineer other people's ideas and solutions, you can figure out how to reverse engineer that into these common sorts of like 4, 5, 6 steps. And then write those out on little post-it notes and put them around your monitor, put them around your laptop, or keep them in a notebook or something. So the next time you face a technical challenge like this person is asking about, like how do I improve my logic, it's going to come down mostly to recognizing what kind of problem it is. And once you have a pretty good feel for like this feels like this kind of algorithm or that kind of algorithm, then you can apply those strategies. That's the best way to start with that. Now, once you apply that strategy, you still have to kind of fill in all of the other things that you have to do, because those strategies, like the strategy for one kind of problem, isn't going to solve everything. Like that backtracking thing that I just described, you've got those 4 common steps, but there's still other work that has to happen around that loop, and maybe other things that should happen inside that loop for how you need to process what you're doing. So you can start with those strategies, but then you have to figure out then how do I fill in all of the other steps. And a lot of that honestly comes down to practice as well. Like how do you practice breaking a problem down into smaller and smaller pieces? When I started college back in 1993, 1993 is when I started my electrical engineering program. I switched to computer engineering in 1994. And my first class that I had at that college, the professor walked in and said, okay, you're going to work as part of a team, and you're going to like shout out instructions. We want to have a robot cross the street. So how do we tell the robot to cross the street? And so we're just shouting out like really high level things, like just take a step forward and walk. And he's like, okay, well, you take a step forward and you fall off the sidewalk. And we're all like, well, you didn't tell us we're on a sidewalk. And he kind of shot back and is like, well, you need to ask clarifying questions. Like you can't just assume you have all of the information. Like you have to ask for that kind of information. And so we got better at asking him those clarifying questions and coming up with more and more steps. And so it's really the process of how do you take a problem, break it down into smaller and smaller pieces to where the piece is so small that now you can write a line of code to solve that, and then probably back up from there, and then like back up a step from there. Because generally your pseudocode shouldn't be so specific that you can turn the pseudocode into real code, like a one-to-one line of code kind of thing. Your pseudocode should still be pretty vague. But that's kind of the preparation that you need to do to get better at those programming logic problems. If you have other questions about that, please reach out to me. I'm happy to discuss that in deeper detail. Again, similar kind of question. Someone's asking how much LeetCode is necessary for somebody starting out in order to be prepared for technical interviews. And I've heard a lot of people say, oh, I've been doing LeetCode. I've got like 300 problems, 500 problems, 900 problems. And it's not really the quantity. It really comes down to the quality of how you're spending that time. And I use an analogy on the stream, and I've used an analogy, in other videos and talks, where the quantity doesn't matter as much as the quality. And it comes down to this sort of analogy. I don't have my prop handy, but I've got like a little 3-pound weight that I keep near my desk as a visual aid. I could go to the gym and I could work out and say, well, I'm going to do 300 reps on this machine, but I'm not necessarily going to get better at using that machine. I'm not necessarily going to get better at how to build up certain kinds of muscle or how to move properly without somebody there who knows what's going on that can coach me along the way. And so how to get better at these things, like you can certainly take the advice that I just gave in my previous question about, reverse engineering those leak code answers to come up with a pseudocode, to understand the strategy of leak code problems. But just reading through all the strategies isn't the same as actually sitting down and practicing. This kind of goes back to another saying that I heard recently, like you can read all the books you want about how to ride a bike, but until you actually get on a bike and try to pedal the bike yourself, it's not the same kind of experience. At the same time, I could get on a bike and I could try to pedal the pedals and I could try to move the handlebars, but without somebody there telling me what to do, I'm kind of figuring out my own way, and it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to do it properly or do it the most effective way. So practicing leak code is one thing, but getting feedback from somebody on how well you're doing those problems is just as important. So it's not about grinding 300 or 500 or 900 or however many problems there are in leak code now. It's not about the quantity. It's about getting good feedback from somebody saying, hey, this part of the process you're doing really well. This part of the process, you need to spend a little more time, figuring out how to do that part more efficiently or more effectively. For example, I see a lot of people do these technical challenges where they hear the problem, they might ask a couple of clarifying questions, and then they immediately jump into code. And I usually coach people afterwards. It's like, okay, well, that process worked out pretty good, but when you jump into the code like that, sometimes to the interviewer, to me, it feels like you're still designing the code while you're writing the code. And that's not as effective as if you take a step back and design it out first and then just go implement your design. If you're trying to figure out the design while you're already writing the code, you may find yourself a bit trapped in a corner because you've kind of already made decisions, and changing your mind on that means you've got to now go change actual code that you've written. If you start with a design where you're writing out that pseudocode, it's far easier to change pseudocode, especially for languages like Java or C++, which are very verbose languages compared to high-level languages like Python, Ruby, JavaScript, and so on, and C# to some extent, that it becomes much easier to write that pseudocode because it's a lot less sort of structure about what you're going to write to then actually go turn into real actual code. For higher level languages like Python and Ruby, it's a little bit harder to write pseudocode for those because Python's practically pseudocode already. So when it comes to these kinds of problems, taking a step back and working out that design first actually makes you more effective at writing that code. You tend to refactor your code less. Debugging tends to be a lot easier when you do run into a problem. So I generally coach people like, always take a step back, design that code first. Don't just jump straight into code and start writing code. You have to think through the whole problem. Otherwise, you're going to write some code and then realize like, oh shoot, I did this part, in a way that now I've got to go back and change. And that takes a lot of extra time because now you're going back and changing a bunch of code, and that might have implications on other things. So it's much, much easier if you just take that step back and design it out first. So hopefully those ideas will help, give you some thoughts on how to better prepare for those kinds of things. That it's not about the quantity of the leak code problems. It's about the quality of how you're spending that time and whether or how you're getting feedback. Worst case scenario, I do mock interviews on interviewing.io, and I can drop a referral code in the show notes. And I do bang interviewing-io. And I've got a referral code that I'll put in the Twitch chat as well. If you want to sign up for interviewing.io, you can reach out to the support team and you can ask if you can do mock interviews with me specifically. You can ask for me by name. And I also do 3-session and 5-session preparation series. So you can actually get me for like 3 sessions or 5 sessions. They are more expensive than just the one-off mock interviews. But in those mock interviews, I'll walk you through a technical challenge and I'll give you very direct feedback on this part you did really well, this part you need to spend some extra time. And it's that kind of coaching that's going to make you much, much better at these kinds of problems. So then as you go back and you do more Leak Code problems or HackerRank or Code Wars or any of these sites, you're going to be that much more effective. So having a coach, having somebody there that can help you through those is going to be much more effective than just doing it on your own. All right, next one on the list. In a 1-hour technical interview, I was given 2 problems. I solved one of them and didn't have time to complete the other one. Did I fail? Here's a little thing that some people don't realize. When you walk into a technical interview like that, your interviewer is generally going to have a whole bunch of problems ready to go. They will typically have 4 or 5 different problems that they can give you. And those 4 or 5 different problems, for some reason, my camera just froze. I don't know if my audio is still going or not. Is my audio still going? Yeah, my audio is still going. For some reason, my camera froze. So let me go back and check the webcam. See, no, is that, there we go. All right, the camera's back on. Sorry about that. All right, so let's go back and capture that question again. In a 1-hour technical interview, I was given 2 problems. I solved one of them, but I didn't have time to complete the second one. Did I fail? So interviewers that come into an interview like that, they're generally going to have 4 or 5 questions ready to go. They're not just going to come in with one question, because if you solve that one question really fast, they don't want to just sit there and twiddle their thumbs. And so they're going to give you as many technical problems as you can solve within probably that 40-minute time span. There's usually going to be a couple of minutes of introduction at the beginning, and then they'll say, okay, cool, let's get down to it. And they're going to give you a technical challenge or 2 or 3, depending on how quickly you get through them. And then they're going to kind of reserve a block of time at the end to maybe ask you some additional questions, maybe ask you some questions about how you wrote the code the way you did or why you wrote the code the way you did. And they also want the kind of the inevitable, do you have any questions for me? Kind of question at the end. And I've got a whole video on that. I had a whole panel of people. Hey, thanks for the follow. I had a whole panel of people, and I'll find that for you, on what questions you should ask in an interview. I'm going to drop that one in chat here as well. I'll also put all of these things in the show notes, both for the podcast and YouTube later on. But this YouTube video, I had a whole bunch of people just to help talk about like what kinds of questions should you ask at an interview. So otherwise, in that 40-minute or so block where you're actually writing code, they're going to give you as many technical challenges as possible. So try not to overthink, the fact that, you were given several problems and one of them you were able to solve, but you ran out of time or you just didn't get very far in one of them. They're going to have lots of those problems, because if you do hit kind of a roadblock or you really stumble on something, they're going to say, okay, well, let's stop working on this one. Let's work on this one instead. And so they'll kind of start in the middle of the road. And if they need to go on an easier problem, they'll have an easier problem. If they say, oh, well, you crushed that one, let me give you a harder one, they're going to move to a harder one, because they want to see how you think on your feet. They want to see how well you can kind of problem solve on the fly. It's not about trying to stump you. It's just to hear you work through the process of how do you hear that problem? How do you break it down into steps? How do you solve those problems in steps? And then can you actually come up with a solution? And then they start sort of grading, well, how efficient was that solution? Was it a good solution? Was it the best solution that they've seen or that they know about, and so on? Lots of different considerations that go into that. So like I said, they'll have a block of time where you are going to be writing code, and as many problems as you can solve, they're going to keep giving you problems. You're not going to exhaust their list of problems that they can give you. Now, if they start giving you like a medium problem and you crush that and you do really well, and they give you a hard problem and you also do well on that, they're going to have like probably 2 or 3 at that level. If you do happen to, let's say you work your way up into that hard level and you actually exhaust their list, they'll be like, all right, cool, you did amazing on that. Let's just sit down and talk about like, how did you actually practice for this kind of stuff? They're going to be curious about that. And I think that's where it could turn into more of that conversation. But they're going to do their best to fill up that 40 minutes, 45 minutes, depending on how much time they want to take with just coding, because they want to see you working in different kinds of solutions on different kinds of algorithms to really get that idea of what do you know and what don't you know. Because that's my job as the interviewer. I need to find the limits of your knowledge, and then figure out if that's what my team needs. That's my only job as the interviewer, is to find those limits of your knowledge and figure out whether that fits on my team. And so I'm going to give you as many questions as I can within that amount of time. Now, if it's coming down where we've only got like 5 minutes left, I may just ask you to talk about something, at a high level, like, hey, if I were to give you a problem about this, how would you solve it? Like, don't actually write any code. Just talk me through what your process would be. They'll do their best to fill up like that last couple of minutes of time, or they'll say like, hey, let's just, you got any questions for me? Let's just chat a little bit more. And maybe they can give you like a bathroom break or something like that, or say like, hey, come back in 5 minutes and we'll continue the conversation, something along those lines. All right. So the next one on the list is similar to a question that I asked the last time on the Q&A, and they said, is it possible to postpone Facebook's technical interview for a month in order to better prepare? And I did address this question previously. It was worded a little bit different. It was just like, how do I postpone? Like, I need more time. And it really comes down to the reason for postponing. And what I said in that answer kind of still applies here. If the company is really large and they're constantly hiring, it's totally okay to postpone, because they're going to be constantly hiring people. They've got people resigning all the time, and they're constantly hiring new people, and they're also growing, and they've got oodles of money. When it's a smaller company, it's probably going to be a little bit harder to postpone, because they probably only have like 1 or 2 roles that they're trying to fill, not dozens or hundreds. And so if you need to postpone for a month, it's probably not going to work out very well. And they'll probably say, well, yeah, you can postpone, but we're hoping to hire fairly soon. And so they may, they probably won't ask questions as to why you want to postpone, and you don't have to give reasons. You can just call them up and say, hey, something came up on my side. Can I postpone? Can I do an interview, in November, early November instead of early October? They'll generally say, yeah, okay. But if they hire in the meantime, they're just going to close down that job. And, whether you get a phone call back saying, hey, we filled the job, like, don't bother, thanks anyway. Or they might contact you if they think you're a really good candidate. They may contact you and say like, hey, just FYI, we've been, we're still interviewing for this role. We'd still like you to interview soon. And so you'll kind of have to play off of their level of conversation about it. But again, kind of the same advice applies. If it's a smaller company, you're going to have a harder time postponing, because they're going to fill that role and then not need anybody else for a while. But in a much larger company where they're constantly hiring, it's totally okay to postpone, and you don't even have to give them a reason why. You just say like, hey, I'd like to interview mid-November instead, and that'll generally be fine. Cool. For the new people that are joining on chat, you're more than welcome at any time to drop questions in chat. If you've got questions about the technical interview process, career coaching, resume reviews, anything like that, please feel free to just drop things in chat and say hi. Or just drop in chat and say hi. Let me know where you're from, and let me know what's going on. If you're job hunting, if you got questions about that kind of stuff, just reach out and let me know, and I will answer those as part of the live stream, or I'll just queue up the question for next time. Just going to take a little drink break here. All right, let's keep going down the list here. Excuse me. All right, the next one on the list. As an experienced software developer, how much time do you take to prepare for a technical interview before applying for an open position? This is a good question. So I recently did a job change myself this summer. I was teaching at the Turing School of Software and Design. Taught there for close to 4 years, not quite 4 years. Actually, yesterday would have been my 4-year anniversary if I'd stayed, but I left mid-June. And I had known for about a month or so, almost 2 months prior to that I was going to leave. Well, a month for sure. I'd been kind of toying with the idea for a month prior to that, like as far back as like mid to late April. And so when it came to preparation time, like how do I want to prepare for interviews, some of it's taking my own advice around some of the topics that I address here on the stream and that I produce then into the podcast and the YouTube videos and so on about how to study those kinds of algorithms and data structures and things like that. But for a senior level developer, for the amount of experience I have, because I've been in the industry for 25 years, the kinds of questions that you get asked are a little bit different, but it also depends on the kind of role that I would apply to. If I was applying for more of an architect, staff engineer, principal engineer kind of role, like that really super senior kind of level, they're going to ask questions about how do I implement like whole systems, and work with my team to make sure that I'm helping my whole team level up in their skill and their experience and so on. As just kind of the what I would consider kind of entry level, senior level, like you're just getting into that senior level role where you got like 5, 6, 7 years experience. Depending on companies will hire you as a senior developer with like 3 or 4 years experience. It really depends on sort of how you've been spending that time. When you're fairly new at calling yourself a senior developer, they're really going to be focusing a lot of questions around like efficiencies and optimizations, maybe a little bit around mentorship, but it's probably going to be about like how do you take code that somebody with less experience than you has written and how do you make that better? When you start getting into, like I said, kind of the even more senior level type roles like lead developers and staff developers and principals and so on and architects, then it becomes about like how do you build whole systems? And there's probably going to be more components of system design and a lot of the more like data pipelining types of questions, like how do you get data from this system over to this system in an efficient manner? And how can that scale and deal with fault tolerance and redundancies and all that kind of stuff. And, you start getting into parallelism and that sort of stuff. And so the kinds of questions that I would have been asked. So I actually, when I decided I was going to stop working at Turing, I actually put a profile up on hired.com just as kind of an initial like, I wonder, if I put my profile on there and I ask for like ridiculous level salary, whether anybody would even take a bite. And I actually had 3 companies reach out that same day going, yeah, we want to interview you. And I'm like, you know how much money I was asking for, right? Like you saw that part. Not that I believe I deserved that amount of money, but I'm just like, let's see what's out there. Let's see whether anybody would even contact me with my experience for that amount of money. And 3 companies did. And I did an initial phone screen with one of them, and the initial phone screen went really well. And then they described what their interview process was going to be. It was going to be like multiple days doing multiple interviews with multiple people. And I'm like, oh, that sounds awful. Like, why not speed that process up a little bit? But from a company's perspective, if they're hiring somebody for a lot of salary, they want to make sure they're really hiring the right person. So it makes sense. So when, the more experience that you get, the kinds of questions that you're going to get asked and expect to answer are going to vary a lot. Ultimately, though, it really comes down to the same kinds of things I always talk about. What do you know? What don't you know? Is that stuff going to fit in on my team? Are you going to fit in on the team? Are people going to like to work with you? Do you come across as somebody who's very personable? Like you could teach me something as an interviewer. Anytime I ever interviewed somebody with more experience than me, I would always kind of pry into why are you doing it that way? Like, can you explain to me why you're doing it that way? Because when I bring senior level people on my team, I want to make sure that they're going to work with the juniors and the intermediates on my team to help level them up. And so I want them to help the rest of my team get better. And so during that interview, I'm going to ask some questions that are going to kind of get them into sort of a teaching mode. Like, oh, teach me something about such and such. And listen and really kind of engage in their answers a little bit to see how well they could teach a concept or explain why something happens the way that it does. Because that's the kind of person that I would want to hire in that role. Every company is going to be a little bit different though. But as you gain more and more experience, it's going to pivot a lot less away from the actual code, because in the really senior positions, you're not actually writing very much code anymore. You're spending more time like designing out whole systems and sort of directing how these multiple systems are going to get built and interact with each other and kind of intercommunicate with each other. and less time actually sitting down writing code yourself. You're going to be kind of delegating that responsibility out to other lead engineers who are then going to lead their team to go build that component for you. And that's kind of the hierarchy that you get into. Again, depending on the size of the company. If the company is quite small and they bring you on as like, staff engineer, in a small company that really doesn't mean anything. I often chuckle in small startups, less than say 40, 50 people, the quote unquote CTO is really just the lead developer of the whole company. They're the person with the most experience and the most knowledge of how all the things plug in together. And so they just kind of get, tagged with this title of CTO. Looks like my video froze up again. Not sure what's going on with the video. There we go. I'll have to check into that a little later. All right. But the audio still seems to be going through. Cool. Let's grab a couple more questions, and I'm going to wrap it up for the day. Let's see. So a little bit similar to a question that I answered a little bit earlier this evening. In a technical interview, I made a minor syntax error and couldn't answer a question and then gave a wrong answer. Apart from that, in the 30-minute interview, everything else went really well. Is that going to be a problem? If it's just verbal questions, or they ask like, what would the syntax of, how would I split a string into an array of characters or something like that? If you don't get the syntax perfect on that, I would say if they care about that, they're probably the wrong kind of company to work for, to be honest. I think companies that ask and expect that you kind of memorize the minutia of like every little syntax call and every little API call within a language or a framework, those kinds of companies, they're a little hard to work for sometimes, because if they're that particular about you must have this like intricate, trivial knowledge of how things work in your language and your framework, what's it going to be like to work there on a day-to-day basis? Are they going to micromanage everything? Are they going to expect that you don't ever have to look up documentation, and you're just going to be really quick to implement all this stuff because you got all this stuff memorized? Like, there can be a time and place for that, but generally speaking, you want to avoid working for companies that have that as an expectation as part of their interview process. And so going back to the question, they were saying like, I made a syntax error, and then I couldn't answer a question, and then I gave a wrong answer to something else. So it sounds like a whole like cascading thing that might just come down to preparation. Again, as an interviewer, I just need to find out what you know and what you don't know. And so for their particular question that they asked, they gave a syntax error. So, they got some code wrong. That's probably not going to stop things. It's probably okay. If you couldn't answer a question, again, that's probably okay. It's just my job to find out what you know and what you don't know. But then later on, they gave a wrong answer to something else. Like I asked a specific question and you gave me a completely wrong answer. Now within 30 minutes, you gave me like 3 bad things. So they said, apart from that, everything else went very well. Well, maybe, or maybe you think it went well, but did you really get all of the other questions answered properly and so on? So is it going to be a problem? Again, it kind of depends a little bit on what their sort of rubric is for how they kind of go through and they write out their notes on how well they know certain sorts of topics. Like if they were asking you specifics about, say, the Python language, and you wrote some Python syntax incorrectly, it's probably not the end of the world. Like if you get the parameters out of order or something like that. But then, they said, well, later on, I couldn't answer a question like, how do you get the length of a string or something like that? And you just didn't know the answer. And then later on, they ask, well, how would you split a string into an array? And you give them the wrong method call. You're kind of showing that you don't know very much about the language, because those are kinds of like basic things that I would expect like an entry-level developer to know. But if you've got experience, like if you're an experienced level dev, I'm not going to be asking you those kinds of questions, because you're going to just go figure that stuff out. I mean, let's be real. On the job, you're going to be Googling that stuff and looking up documentation all the time anyway. That's why I was saying early in my answer, if they're that particular that you must have all these kinds of things memorized, you probably don't want to work there. And that interviewer is probably in dire need of some training on how to interview people properly. Because they should just be asking like conceptual things, like how do you use channels in Go, or how do you, What are some different ways that you can iterate over a loop in Ruby, and which one do you find yourself using the most and why? Those kinds of things. And they're more open-ended, where there's not one correct answer. Because the kinds of questions where there's only one correct answer doesn't allow for a lot of flexibility. And in my mind, that would make me think that the company then is very rigid about how they want things implemented. And that's not generally the kind of company I would want to work for. I would want some amount of flexibility on that kind of stuff, to know that, whatever I contribute is being appreciated, that it doesn't have to, necessarily conform exactly to what their expectation is. Cool. Let's find one more here on the list. A lot of these are repetitive. Like, how do I start practicing? What's the technical process for such and such company? I don't know. I've never interviewed at that particular company that you're asking me about. So ask them what their process is. And if they won't tell you, then I would ask them why they won't share that information. I think it's okay to ask a company what kinds of topics you should study and be prepared for. Let's find one that's a little bit unique here on the list. Yeah, again, lots of how do I get a job with this company? How do I prepare for this particular kind of company's technical interview? Again, kind of blanket answers. Just ask them. I don't necessarily know every company out there. And a lot of the big FANG companies, they publish full range of documentation on how to prepare for their interviews. So when in doubt, just ask that company. I think that's pretty much it for now. A lot of these start getting very repetitive, about giving feedback to candidates and so on. So I think I'll wrap up there. If you do have other questions, you're always welcome to reach out through the website. So if you go to techinterview.guide, I'm just going to pull up the website here myself. So techinterview.guide. Down on the menu bar on the left side, you'll see my email address, and you got my Twitter, my LinkedIn, Facebook. Although I think I changed the Facebook link. I need to fix that on the website, and also my GitHub. So you can reach out to me on all those platforms. I'll fix the Facebook one later tonight. I've got some other preparation material that I need to deploy pretty soon. So I'm doing a large resume and LinkedIn talk in a couple of weeks, and so I'm getting some resource material together for that. So I will get those fixed. But yeah, by all means, you can email me. You can DM me on LinkedIn. A lot of the questions that I do on here, I do from LinkedIn or from Quora, where I get asked to answer questions. I started answering them on Quora. I've actually got quite a history of stuff on Quora. They've since released Quora Plus, which is a paid platform. Not really a fan of platforms that start out free and then suddenly switch to a paid thing, where if you want to see my answers, now you got to paid, into this Quora.com, or Quora Plus thing, in order to see my answers. Not a huge fan of that, but I get it. From a business perspective, it makes sense for them to make money, because they got to make money to, keep running the site and so on. But, there are disadvantages there where good answers suddenly get buried behind a paywall. But by all means, ask me questions. I will get them on a live stream in the future. I will queue them up. I'm going to start aiming to do these Q&A sessions maybe only a couple times a month. I really want to get back into some resume reviews. And so you can find information on that on techinterview.guide/streaming. There's a form down at the bottom of that page where you can submit a resume, and I give you some ideas on there on how to anonymize yourself. If you don't want to anonymize yourself, that's totally okay. I do recommend that you do, though, because I do spend 20 to 30 minutes kind of going over your resume, and so all your contact info is going to be out there for the world to see. And so I do recommend that you anonymize that stuff. Anonymize your name, anonymize your phone number and your email address, things like that on the resume. I recommend doing. But you can submit the resume that way, and I will do a review on the stream. If you want a private one, you can contact me about doing a private resume review, or on the streaming link. If you just submit the resume in there, there's a little there's a field on the form where you can kind of describe what kind of feedback you want. You can just say I'm looking for a private resume review. I do charge money for the private ones just because it's kind of taking up like time away from the stream to actually do that. Otherwise, I just do it as part of the stream, and so I don't charge money for it. But if you want a paid one, I usually ask for $50 on PayPal. And let's see, aside from that, so this Thursday, I don't think I have a guest this Thursday. Sunday, I might have a guest. And then again, just to kind of recap, on October 14th, I'm going to have Dan Moore on the site. He wrote this really great book, Letters to a New Developer. So I'm looking forward to having Dan on the stream and chat a little bit about how he helps people with interview preparation and career coaching and things like that. So definitely drop by for that. And that's pretty much all I'll do for tonight. So have a good night, everyone, and be safe. And if you do have interview questions in the meantime, reach out to me. I'm here to help. There's a huge community out here that wants to help you out. Cool. Rahomo, thanks for the follow earlier, and hope this was helpful for you. And definitely drop questions in next time. And we'll see you then. Have a great week, everyone. Cheers.